I watched my best friend's family destroy itself over $2 million in less than 6 months, and the worst part is, I saw it coming the moment their father's lawyer opened that envelope. What I didn't see coming was how one sister would end up in a hospital bed, another would disappear with half the money, and their brother would lose everything including his marriage, all because of 7 words hidden in a will that nobody expected. But before I tell you how it all fell apart, you need to understand how perfect everything seemed just 3 days before the reading of that will, because that's when I noticed the first crack, the one that would eventually shatter everything. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you need to see what I saw. My name doesn't matter in this story, but I've known the Morrison family for 15 years, close enough to be at their Thanksgiving dinners, close enough to see what happens when people think nobody's watching. Sarah Morrison was my college roommate, and through her I met her siblings, Michael and Jennifer, and honestly, they seemed like the kind of family you see in movies, the ones that make you wish you grew up in their house instead of yours. Their dad, Robert Morrison, built a commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing. I'm talking about a guy who started with 1 rental property in 1978 and turned it into 23 buildings across 4 states, and their mom, Patricia, she was this warm force of nature who held everything together. The kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and made you feel like you mattered every single time you walked through their door. The thing about the Morrisons that made them different was how genuine they seemed, and I know how that sounds, like I'm setting up some fairy tale before it all comes crashing down, but I need you to understand that these weren't people pretending to be close. They actually called each other every week, they actually showed up for each other's kids' school plays, they actually seemed to enjoy being in the same room together. Sarah was the oldest at 38, a physician with 2 kids, married to Tom who worked in finance, and on paper they had everything figured out, the big house in the suburbs, the private school tuition paid up front, the kind of life where you vacation in Europe and nobody has to check their bank account first. Michael was the middle child, 35, and he'd followed his father into real estate, working alongside Robert for 12 years, learning every aspect of the business, showing up at 6 in the morning and leaving at 8 at night, dedicating his entire adult life to building on what his father created. Then there was Jennifer, 32, the baby of the family, and she'd taken a completely different path, married young to a guy named Derek, had 3 kids by the time she was 28, and chose to be a stay-at-home mom while Derek worked as a high school teacher, which meant money was always tight for them, not desperate but definitely watching every dollar in a way her siblings never had to. Their parents died 6 months apart, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this part because it was brutal to watch. Patricia got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January, and by April she was gone, just like that, 3 months from diagnosis to funeral, and Robert, I truly believe he never recovered from losing her. He tried to keep going, tried to maintain that strength everyone always associated with him, but something fundamental broke inside him when Patricia died. He'd sit in their house, in the chair next to where she used to sit, just staring at nothing, and when you talked to him it was like he was responding from somewhere far away. Sarah called me crying one night in August, said her dad had been hospitalized with what they thought was a stroke but turned out to be a massive heart attack, and 2 days later he was gone too. I remember standing at his funeral thinking how he'd probably wanted to go, how losing Patricia had taken something essential from him that he couldn't get back, and I remember looking at the 3 siblings standing there together, arms around each other, thinking at least they had each other, at least they'd get through this together the way families are supposed to. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, standard procedure, time for everyone to grieve and settle immediate affairs, and I wasn't supposed to be there obviously, this was family business, but Sarah asked me to wait with her at her house afterward because she said she needed someone outside the family to talk to, someone who wouldn't be emotionally invested in whatever the will said. The night before the reading, Sarah came over to my place, and we sat on my back porch drinking wine, and she seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen her before. She kept saying everything would be fine, they'd all discussed it years ago, Robert had always been fair, there wouldn't be any surprises, but there was this edge to her voice that made me pay attention. I asked her straight up what she was worried about, and she got quiet for a long minute before she said Michael had been making comments lately, little things about how he'd sacrificed his whole career to work with their dad while she and Jennifer got to do whatever they wanted, how he'd earned a bigger share because he'd put in the work, how fair didn't always mean equal. She laughed when she said it, tried to play it off like Michael was just being dramatic because he was grieving, but I could see it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The reading happened at the lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning in September, and Sarah called me right after, told me to come over. She needed to talk. Her voice sounded strange, flat and shocked in equal measure, and when I got to her house all three siblings were there plus their spouses, and the tension in that room was thick enough to choke on. Here's what Robertswell said, and I'm going to give you the exact breakdown because this is where everything started falling apart. The estate was worth $2.3 million after taxes and final expenses, which included the commercial properties, investment accounts, the family home, everything. Robert left the house to be sold and the proceeds split equally three ways, no issues there, straightforward and fair, but then came the part that detonated everything. He left 40% of the remaining estate to Michael, 35% to Sarah, and 25% to Jennifer, and attached to this division was a letter explaining his reasoning, and that letter, those 7 words I mentioned at the beginning, they destroyed everything. In the letter, Robert wrote that Michael had earned a larger share through his dedicated partnership and sacrifice, that Sarah's established financial success meant she needed less support than her siblings, and then he wrote this, and I'm telling you these are the 7 words that changed everything. Jennifer's husband lacks professional ambition, therefore her portion reflects this concern. 7 words that told Jennifer her father thought her husband wasn't good enough, that Derek's choice to be a teacher instead of chasing money was somehow a character flaw, that she deserved less because of who she'd chosen to marry. Sarah read me parts of that letter, and I physically felt sick listening to her, because I absolutely knew in that moment that this family was about to tear itself apart, and there wasn't anything any of them could do to stop it. Jennifer left the lawyer's office and didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. Derek was absolutely humiliated, furious in a way that was completely justified if you ask me, because imagine being told by your dead father-in-law that you're not good enough, that your profession isn't valuable enough, that your entire life's work as an educator is somehow less than because you're not making 6 figures. Michael tried to call it fair, kept saying their dad had the right to distribute his assets however he wanted, that he'd worked side by side with Robert for 12 years and this was recognition of that partnership, but you could see even he was uncomfortable with how brutal that letter was to Jennifer and Derek. Sarah was caught in the middle, upset about her own smaller share compared to Michael, but also horrified by what her father had written about Derek, and she kept saying she'd split some of her portion with Jennifer, that they needed to fix this, but Michael shut that down immediately, said if they started redistributing against their father's wishes they'd dishonor his memory and create legal complications. The first real explosion happened 4 days after the will reading at what was supposed to be a family dinner to discuss logistics, selling the house, distributing personal items, handling final business affairs, all the practical stuff that needs to happen after someone dies. I wasn't there, but Sarah told me every detail that night, crying so hard she could barely get the words out. They met at the family house, the one that held decades of memories, holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday nights, and within 30 minutes they were screaming at each other in a way Sarah said she'd never witnessed in her entire life. Jennifer finally broke her silence, stood up and said she was contesting the will, that their father was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote it, that grief over losing their mother had impaired his judgment, and she wasn't going to accept being told she was worth less because of who she married. Michael exploded, started yelling about how she'd barely visited their dad after Mom died, how he'd been there every single day, how convenient it was that she cared about fairness now that money was involved, and Sarah jumped in trying to mediate, trying to calm everyone down, but Tom, her husband, he made everything worse by suggesting they just accept the will as written and move on because fighting it would cost more in legal fees than Jennifer would gain, which was probably true but absolutely the wrong thing to say in that moment. Derek, who'd been silent up until then, stood up and told Michael exactly what he thought of him, called him a greedy manipulator who'd probably been poisoning their father against him for years, and Michael shot back that Derek was a loser who'd never provided properly for Jennifer and was now trying to steal money he hadn't earned, and that's when Tom physically stepped between them because it looked like they were about to actually fight. Grown men in their 30s about to throw punches in their dead parents' house over money and wounded pride. Jennifer grabbed her kids and left, told Sarah on the way out that she was done. She wouldn't be part of a family that valued money over people, that treated her husband like garbage, that looked at her 3 beautiful children and saw dollar signs instead of human beings. Sarah said she sat on the floor of that house after everyone left and cried for 2 hours, surrounded by her parents' things, and for the first time in her life she felt completely alone even though she still had siblings, because she realized in that moment they might never recover from this. What happened next is where this story gets really dark, and I need you to stay with me because this is important. Jennifer hired a lawyer, an aggressive one who specialized in will contests, and she built a case around Robert's mental state after Patricia's death, brought in the hospitalization records, got statements from his doctors about depression and grief, painted a picture of a man who wasn't thinking clearly when he made those final decisions. Michael countered by hiring his own lawyer and fighting the contest with everything he had, spending thousands of dollars that should have been going to his own kid's future, and the legal battle turned vicious in a way that made the initial fight look like a minor disagreement. Depositions got scheduled where siblings had to testify against each other under oath, where lawyers asked them to quantify how much time they'd spent with their father, whether they'd noticed cognitive decline, if they thought he'd been manipulated, and every question felt designed to make them betray each other, to turn love and loyalty into legal ammunition. Sarah tried to stay neutral, refused to testify for either side, told both Michael and Jennifer she loved them and wanted them to work it out, but neutrality turned out to be its own kind of betrayal because both of them felt abandoned by her, both of them wanted her support and felt rejected when she wouldn't choose a side. Tom started pressuring Sarah to support Michael, arguing that the will was clear and legal challenges were wrong, that they needed to think about their own financial future, and this created cracks in Sarah's marriage that hadn't been there before, arguments late at night about money and family and where loyalty should lie. Meanwhile, Derek was becoming obsessed with the case, spending hours researching inheritance law, talking about justice and respect, and Jennifer told Sarah she barely recognized him anymore, that the man she'd married was disappearing under layers of rage and humiliation. 3 months into the legal battle, something happened that changed everything again, and this is where I watched my friends start to break in real time. Michael's wife, Rebecca, came to Sarah's house unannounced on a Saturday morning, and she was crying, shaking, could barely get words out, and when she finally calmed down enough to speak she told Sarah that Michael had taken out a second mortgage on their house to pay legal fees, hadn't told her until the papers arrived, had essentially gambled their family's security on winning a court case, and Rebecca said she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't watch him destroy himself and their marriage over money and pride, couldn't explain to their kids why Daddy was always angry, why they couldn't see their aunt and uncle anymore, why Grandpa's death had made everything bad instead of bringing them together. Sarah called me that afternoon and I drove over immediately, found her sitting in her car in her own driveway, just sitting there staring at nothing, and when I got in the passenger seat she turned to me and said, "I don't know who my brother is anymore." I look at him and see a stranger wearing my brother's face. She told me about Rebecca's visit, about the mortgage, about how Michael had become so consumed with winning that he couldn't see he was losing everything that actually mattered, and then she said something that haunted me. She said, "I keep thinking about that letter, about Dad's words about Derek lacking ambition, and I wonder if Dad saw something in all of us, some fundamental brokenness or greed or weakness that we kept hidden until money brought it to the surface." I didn't know what to say to that, still don't, because maybe she was right, maybe we're all just a few dollars away from becoming people we wouldn't recognize, people we'd be ashamed to look at in the mirror. The case went on for another 2 months, depositions and motions and legal maneuvering that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and then something unexpected happened that nobody saw coming. The judge, before ruling on the will contest, ordered all parties into mandatory mediation, said the family was destroying itself and court intervention should be a last resort, and reluctantly all three siblings agreed to try. The mediation happened in a conference room at the courthouse, lawyers present but mostly silent, a professional mediator who'd handled hundreds of family disputes, and for 6 hours they sat in that room and talked, really talked for the first time since the will reading. I wasn't there obviously, but Sarah told me everything that happened, and this is where the story takes a turn that I think about constantly. Jennifer spoke first, and she didn't talk about money or percentages or legal strategy. She talked about being 12 years old and breaking her arm falling off her bike, and how their dad had picked her up so gently, told her she was brave, sat with her in the emergency room for 5 hours making up silly stories to keep her from crying, and she said that's the dad I want to remember, not the one who wrote that letter, not the one who reduced my worth to a percentage, and I need you to understand I'm not fighting for money, I'm fighting because I need to know that my father loved me as much as he loved you, that Derek's career choice didn't make me less valuable in his eyes, that my life mattered even though I chose family over fortune. She was crying by the end, not angry tears but deep grief tears, and the mediator let the silence sit for a long time before asking Michael to respond. Michael, and this surprised everyone, he broke down completely, put his head in his hands and sobbed like a child, and when he could finally speak he said, "I'm so sorry, I've been so wrong, I told myself I was honoring Dad's wishes but really I was just trying to prove I mattered, that all those years working with him meant something, that I wasn't just the middle child trying to earn love through achievement, and I've been so scared that without Dad's validation I'm nothing, that my whole identity was tied to being his partner, his successor, and when that letter gave me the biggest share it felt like he was finally saying I was enough, but I've destroyed everything that actually matters trying to hold on to that feeling, and I don't know how to fix it." Rebecca was crying, Sarah was crying, even the lawyers looked uncomfortable witnessing this level of raw emotion, and the mediator asked if they could find a way forward that honored both their grief and their relationship. What they worked out over the next 2 hours wasn't perfect but it was something, a compromise that left nobody completely happy but gave everyone something they needed. They agreed to split the estate into thirds, equal shares. Michael would pay back some of what he'd received to make it even, and they'd donate their father's letter to be destroyed, never to be discussed again, treated as an artifact of grief rather than truth. Jennifer dropped the contest, they all agreed to pay their own legal fees, and they made a pact right there in that conference room to have dinner together once a month, to not let their parents' death be the end of their family, to try, just try, to remember who they were before money got involved. Sarah said it felt fragile, like they were building something out of broken pieces that might shatter again at any moment, but it was something, it was a start, and for the first time in 6 months she felt like maybe they'd survive this. But here's what the mediator told them before they left, and this is important, this is what makes this whole story matter beyond just one family's drama. She said, "I've been doing this for 23 years, I've seen hundreds of families tear themselves apart over inheritances, and I'm going to tell you something that nobody wants to hear but you need to understand, this will happen again, not the legal battle necessarily but the struggle, because what you're really fighting about isn't money, it's every unresolved feeling from childhood, every perceived favoritism, every time you felt less loved or less valued, and money is just the arena where those battles finally get fought. It's the excuse you've all been waiting for to say the things you've been thinking for decades." She told them they needed therapy, individual and family, that signing an agreement was just the first step, that real healing would take years of honest conversation and uncomfortable truth-telling, and she warned them that holidays would be hard, that someone would inevitably bring up the will fight, that old resentments would surface and they'd have to choose again and again to prioritize relationship over being right. They're trying, that's what I can tell you now, 8 months after the mediation. They've had 6 monthly dinners, and Sarah says they're awkward and sometimes tense but they're happening, which is something. Michael and Rebecca are in marriage counseling, working through the trust issues and financial stress, and Rebecca told Sarah she thinks they might actually make it but it's day by day, choice by choice. Jennifer and Derek moved to a smaller house, something they could afford on Derek's teacher salary plus her portion of the inheritance, and Jennifer started volunteering at her kids' school, finally feeling like her life had value even though her father's letter had tried to say otherwise, and Derek, slowly, very slowly, is letting go of the rage that consumed him, though Sarah says she can still see it flash in his eyes sometimes when Michael says something thoughtless. Sarah herself is in therapy, dealing with guilt and grief and the realization that her family isn't who she thought they were, and she told me recently that she's grateful for that, grateful to see them clearly even though it hurts, because at least now she's relating to real people instead of idealized versions she'd created in her head. The family home sold for $600,000, and they split the proceeds equally, and Sarah said the day they handed over the keys was harder than either funeral, because that house represented a version of their family that doesn't exist anymore, can never exist again, and walking away from it felt like admitting something fundamental had died that couldn't be resurrected. They divided up their parents' belongings, and there were a few tense moments over who got what, but mostly they were able to be generous with each other, to prioritize sentiment over value, and Sarah kept her mother's wedding ring, Jennifer took their mother's recipe box, and Michael got their father's watch, little pieces of who their parents were before death and money complicated everything. Here's what I've learned watching this family almost destroy itself and then slowly, painfully, try to rebuild. Money doesn't corrupt people exactly, it reveals them, strips away the social niceties and polite pretenses and shows you who someone really is when they feel threatened or diminished or scared. The Morrison siblings weren't secretly terrible people waiting for an excuse to betray each other, they were normal people with normal insecurities and unresolved issues who got hit with grief and money at the same time, and that combination is volatile in ways most of us don't understand until we're in the middle of it. Robert Morrison's letter didn't create the problems in that family, it exposed them, brought to the surface every feeling of inadequacy and favoritism and comparison that had been lurking underneath decades of holiday dinners and birthday parties, and once those feelings were visible there was no putting them back in the box, no pretending everything was fine, they had to either deal with them honestly or let them destroy everything. I think about that letter a lot. Those 7 words about Derek lacking ambition, and I wonder what Robert was thinking when he wrote them. Was he trying to motivate Jennifer to push Derek harder, to want more financial success? Was he genuinely worried about their future and trying to provide extra cushion for his other children who he saw as more stable? Or was he, and this is the darkest possibility, was he just expressing a prejudice he'd always held but had been too polite to voice when he was alive, using his will as a final statement of judgment that couldn't be argued with because he wouldn't be around to defend it? I don't know, nobody knows, and that uncertainty is part of what made it so destructive, because each sibling could project their own interpretation onto those words and none of them could be proven wrong. What haunts me most about this whole situation is how preventable it was, not the grief obviously, you can't prevent death and loss, but the family destruction, that was avoidable. If Robert had talked to his kids while he was alive about his estate plans, explained his reasoning, heard their feelings, maybe adjusted things based on their input, this might have gone differently. If he'd been honest about favoring Michael's career dedication or worried about Jennifer's financial stability, said those things out loud when people could respond and process and discuss, maybe the letter wouldn't have been such a devastating shock. If he'd understood that love and money are different things, that you can provide for your children equally even if their circumstances differ, that fairness in family isn't always about exact calculations but about making everyone feel valued, maybe he would have written a different will entirely. But he didn't, and now his children are left trying to love each other across a canyon of hurt feelings and broken trust, and it's hard, it's so much harder than it should be, and that's the real tragedy here. Not the money, not even the temporary family breakdown, but the fact that it didn't have to be this way, that with more communication and less secrecy and better understanding of how inheritance disputes actually work, this family could have grieved together instead of fighting each other, could have used their parents' legacy to build something instead of almost destroying everything their parents had worked to create. Sarah told me something last week that I think captures where they are now. She said, I used to think family was this solid thing, this foundation you could always count on, but now I know it's more like a garden. It needs constant care and attention, and sometimes you have to pull weeds, and sometimes things die and you have to replant, and if you ignore it for too long everything gets overgrown and choked out and you lose what you thought would always be there. She said they're gardening now, all three of them, trying to grow something new in soil that's been poisoned by grief and money and hurt, and some days it feels impossible and some days she sees tiny shoots of green and feels hopeful, and that's all any of them can do, show up and try and hope that eventually what grows back is strong enough to withstand the next storm. I want to tell you about the moment I knew they'd actually survive this, that the family wasn't permanently broken beyond repair. It was Christmas, their first Christmas without either parent, and nobody wanted to host because that felt too hard, too much pressure to recreate something that was gone forever, so they decided to do something completely different, rented a cabin in the mountains, just the three siblings and their families, and Sarah invited me along because she said she needed a neutral presence, someone who could help keep things light if tensions rose. The first day was awkward, everyone tiptoeing around each other, careful with their words, but on Christmas Eve something shifted. Michael's youngest kid, a 6-year-old named Emma, found an old board game in the cabin closet and insisted everyone play, and for 2 hours they sat around this table playing this ridiculous game, laughing at stupid jokes, arguing over rules in a way that was playful instead of vicious, and I watched them transform back into siblings, just for a little while, just long enough to remember what they were fighting to save. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, the three of them sat by the fireplace and talked about their parents, really talked, shared memories and cried and laughed and said things they'd been holding back. Jennifer told a story about their mom teaching her to bake when she was 8, how patient Patricia had been even when Jennifer spilled flour everywhere, how valued and important she'd felt in those moments, and Michael talked about working with their dad, not the business stuff but the quiet moments in the car between properties, how Robert would tell stories about his own father, about struggle and perseverance, how those conversations had shaped who Michael became. Sarah shared how their mom had held her hand during her medical school interviews, had believed in her even when Sarah doubted herself, had been her biggest cheerleader through every challenge, and they all cried together, not angry tears or bitter tears but pure grief tears, missing their parents without the complication of money and wills and hurt feelings. And then Michael said something that changed the dynamic completely. He said, I need to apologize, not for the legal stuff, we've dealt with that, but for something deeper. I was Dad's favorite and I knew it and I never acknowledged it. I benefited from that favoritism my whole life and I let you both feel less than because it made me feel more than, and that was wrong, it was cruel actually, and I'm sorry, I'm so deeply sorry, and I want you to know that you were both better children than I was. You loved Mom and Dad without needing constant validation, without making your worth dependent on their approval, and I'm trying to learn how to do that now, but it's hard. Decades of patterns don't change overnight. Jennifer and Sarah just stared at him, and then Jennifer started laughing, not mean laughter but surprised, relieved laughter, and she said, I've waited 32 years to hear you admit that, and now that you have I realize it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would, because we're here, we're trying, and maybe that's enough. That moment, that's when I knew they'd make it. Not because everything was fixed, problems that deep don't get solved in one conversation, but because they were finally being honest with each other, finally saying the true things instead of the polite things, finally building a relationship based on reality instead of pretense. The rest of the weekend wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still old patterns surfacing, but there was also grace, people extending forgiveness without being asked, choosing connection over correctness, and by the time we packed up to leave, Sarah said to me, this is what family is supposed to be, not perfect people who never hurt each other, but imperfect people who keep showing up even after they've hurt each other, who choose love over being right, who do the hard work of staying connected. I've been thinking a lot about what advice I'd give someone facing a similar situation, because this isn't unique. Families implode over inheritances every single day, and I think the key is this: if you're the person writing the will, have the hard conversations while you're alive, explain your reasoning, hear people's feelings, be willing to adjust if your decisions are causing pain, And for the love of everything holy, don't write letters that express negative judgments about people's life choices or marriages or careers. That kind of commentary from beyond the grave is devastating in ways you can't imagine if you've never been on the receiving end. If you're the person receiving an unequal inheritance, take time before reacting. Understand that hurt feelings are valid, but destroying your family over money you didn't earn and don't need is a choice you'll regret. Talk to a therapist before talking to a lawyer. Consider what you're really fighting for, because if it's respect or validation or proof that you were loved, you're not going to find that in a courtroom. Those things have to come from inside yourself and from honest conversations with the people who hurt you. And if you're watching siblings fight over an inheritance, like I was, be present but don't take sides. Listen without judgment, remind them of who they were before money got involved, and understand that sometimes people need to go through the fire before they can rebuild. Sometimes the destruction is part of the process, even though it's painful to witness. I wanted to fix it for Sarah, wanted to make her pain stop, but I couldn't. Nobody could. She had to walk through it herself, had to feel every bit of the betrayal and loss and disappointment before she could come out the other side, and the best thing I could do was just be there, keep showing up, keep reminding her that she wasn't alone even when her family felt fractured beyond repair. The Morrison family is rebuilding, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and frustrations and moments of real joy and connection, and they're different now, fundamentally changed by what they went through, but maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe the people they're becoming are more authentic than the people they were. Maybe losing the pretense of perfect family unity opened up space for something more real and honest and sustainable. Sarah said recently that she's grateful for the fight, which shocked me when she said it, but she explained that before the inheritance battle she'd never really examined her family dynamics, never questioned the roles they all played or the unspoken rules they followed, never considered that maybe the harmony she remembered from childhood was partly illusion, people performing family rather than truly being family, and now they have a chance to build something real, messy and imperfect, but real. And that's worth the pain they went through to get here. I think about Robert and Patricia Morrison sometimes, wonder what they'd think seeing their children now, whether they'd be proud of how their kids worked through the crisis or horrified that the crisis happened at all. I'd like to think they'd see the resilience, the commitment to staying connected even when it would be easier to walk away, the hard emotional work their children are doing to break old patterns and build healthier relationships, and I'd like to think they'd recognize that their legacy isn't the money or the properties or even the family business. It's three imperfect people who love each other enough to keep trying, who value their relationship more than their pride, who are teaching their own children that family means showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The truth is that inheritance is never just about money, it's about love and value and worth and all the complicated feelings we have about our place in our family, and when you mix those feelings with grief and legal documents and large sums of money, you get a volatile combination that can destroy relationships that survived everything else. The Morrisons almost didn't survive it, came within inches of permanent fracture, and the fact that they're still together, still trying, still showing up for monthly dinners and holiday gatherings, that's not because they're better than other families who've fallen apart over inheritance disputes, it's because they got lucky, they had a mediator who forced them to be honest. They had enough self-awareness to recognize they were destroying something precious, and they made a choice every day. They make the choice to prioritize relationship over resentment, and that's all any of us can do when faced with similar situations. So here's what I want you to take away from this story, because it matters. These lessons matter whether you're dealing with an inheritance dispute right now or you might face one in the future, or you're just trying to understand why families implode over money. First, talk about money and inheritance while everyone's alive, have the uncomfortable conversations, make your wishes known, listen to feedback, be willing to adjust if your plans are causing pain, don't leave surprises that people have to deal with while they're grieving. Second, if you receive an inheritance that feels unfair, take time before reacting, process your feelings with a professional, understand what you're really hurt about, because it's probably not actually the money, it's feeling less valued or less loved, and you can't see your way into feeling more valued. That has to come from emotional work and honest conversations. Third, family is worth fighting for but not worth fighting over. There's a difference. Fighting for your relationship means doing the hard work of communication and forgiveness and change. Fighting over money or stuff or who gets what means destroying the relationship to win a battle that doesn't actually matter in the long run. Fourth, and this is crucial, grief makes people act in ways they normally wouldn't, makes them say things they don't mean, makes them fight battles they wouldn't normally fight, so extend grace both to yourself and to others when navigating the aftermath of death. Understand that weird behavior is often pain trying to find somewhere to go, and don't make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. Fifth, if you're going to write a will that divides things unequally, explain yourself while you're alive. Don't leave a letter that people can't respond to. Don't make judgments about people's life choices or marriages or careers because that kind of commentary is hurtful in ways that outlast your life. And if you have concerns about someone's financial stability or future security, there are ways to address that without making them feel less valued as a human being. And finally, sixth, the point of inheritance isn't to reward the child who performed best or punish the one who chose differently. It's to provide for the people you love and to leave a legacy that honors the life you built. And that legacy gets defined not by the dollar amounts but by how your family treats each other after you're gone, whether they use your resources to build something or to tear each other apart, whether your death brings them together or drives them apart, and that's something you have some control over based on how you handle your estate planning and the conversations you have before you die. The Morrison siblings are still healing, still navigating complicated feelings, still learning how to be family in this new configuration, and they'll probably be doing that work for years, maybe for the rest of their lives, and that's okay. That's what family is supposed to be, not a static perfect thing but a living relationship that changes and grows and requires constant attention and care. They survived something that destroys most families, and while they're not the same people they were before, while they've lost some innocence and illusion, they've gained something too, a deeper understanding of each other, a more honest relationship, a recognition that love isn't about performance or perfection but about showing up and trying even when everything feels broken. I'm still Sarah's best friend, still get invited to the monthly family dinners sometimes, and I watch them navigate their new normal with respect and sadness and hope all mixed together, because what they went through matters, the lessons they learned matter, and sharing their story might help someone else avoid the same mistakes or survive similar circumstances with their family intact. Money is powerful, grief is powerful, and when you combine them you get situations that test everything you thought you knew about the people you love, but those tests don't have to be failures, they can be transformations, painful necessary transformations that strip away what doesn't serve you and reveal what actually matters. I want to tell you about the newest development, something that happened just last month that shows how far they've come and how much work there still is to do. Jennifer announced she was pregnant with her fourth child, completely unexpected at 33, and the family's reaction told me everything about where they are in their healing journey. Michael's first response was joy, genuine uncomplicated joy. He hugged her and started talking about how Emma would be so excited to have another cousin, and then he did something that would have been impossible a year ago. He offered to help financially, said he knew having 4 kids on a teacher's salary would be tight and he wanted to contribute to the baby fund, no strings attached, just family helping family. Jennifer cried, accepted the offer, and later told Sarah it felt like getting her brother back, the real Michael who existed before money and grief turned him into someone she didn't recognize. Sarah threw Jennifer a baby shower, invited both families, and for 4 hours they ate cake and played silly games and celebrated new life, and nobody brought up the will or the fight or any of the pain from the previous year, not because they were avoiding it but because they genuinely moved past it enough that it didn't dominate every interaction anymore. Derek, who'd been the most wounded by Robert's letter, who'd carried that humiliation like a weight on his shoulders for months, stood up at the shower and gave a toast that made everyone cry. He said, "When Jennifer and I got married I knew I'd never be rich. I chose a profession I love over a profession that pays well, and for a long time I felt defensive about that choice, like I had to justify it to everyone including myself, but this family, even through all the pain and fighting, has taught me that worth isn't measured in dollars, that my contribution to the world matters even if it doesn't come with a big paycheck, that the students I teach and the family I love are legacy. Enough and I'm grateful, truly grateful, that we all fought our way back to each other instead of letting money win." Michael stood up after Derek and apologized again, this time publicly, said he'd been wrong about so many things, that he'd let his own insecurities poison his perception of Derek, that he had immense respect for teachers and the work they do, and that his father's letter had been cruel and unjustified and he should have said that from the beginning instead of hiding behind legal rights and inheritance percentages. Rebecca was crying, Sarah was crying, Jennifer was crying, and even some of the friends who'd been invited but didn't know the full backstory were crying because the emotion in that room was so raw and real, and you could feel the healing happening in real time, not complete healing but movement toward it, progress that mattered. They've started a new tradition, something Patricia would have loved. Every Sunday morning they do a video call, all three families, just 15 minutes to check in and share what's happening in their lives and stay connected between the monthly dinners, and Sarah says it's the highlight of her week, seeing her siblings' faces, watching the kids interact, maintaining that thread of connection that almost got severed. Michael's kids and Jennifer's kids have gotten close in a way they weren't before, the older ones understanding in some kid way that their parents almost lost each other and holding on tighter to their cousins because of it, and Sarah's kids, teenagers now, have told her they've learned important lessons about money and family from watching the adults navigate this crisis. Lessons they'll carry into their own lives about what actually matters when everything falls apart. There have been setbacks, moments when old resentments surface. Last month Michael made a comment about Jennifer's spending habits that Derek took the wrong way and they didn't talk for a week, but here's the difference: they worked through it, they called each other, they had an honest conversation about the comment and the hurt feelings and the old wounds that still haven't completely healed, and they moved forward, didn't let one thoughtless comment undo a year of progress. Sarah said that's the real victory, not that they never hurt each other anymore but that they've learned how to repair the hurt when it happens. They've built enough trust that they can be honest about their feelings without everything exploding. They've created space for imperfection and growth and the messy reality of human relationships. I've watched Sarah change through this process in ways that have nothing to do with her siblings and everything to do with herself. She's learned to set boundaries with Tom, to push back when he prioritizes money over relationships, to be clear about her values and what she's willing to compromise on and what she isn't, and their marriage is stronger for it even though the conversations were hard. She's learned that being the peacemaker, the role she'd always played in her family, sometimes means allowing conflict instead of smoothing it over, letting people feel their feelings and work through them instead of rushing to make everyone comfortable, and that's been difficult for her but important, a necessary evolution in how she shows up for the people she loves. She's learned that you can love people and see them clearly at the same time, that acknowledging someone's flaws doesn't mean you love them less, it means you love them more honestly, and that kind of love is more durable than the idealized version she'd been carrying around for 38 years. The commercial real estate business, the one Robert built and Michael dedicated 12 years to, they sold it 6 months ago to an investment group. Michael initially resisted, felt like selling it betrayed his father's memory, but eventually realized he was holding on to something out of obligation rather than passion, that he'd been trying to be his father instead of being himself, and letting go of the business freed him to figure out who he actually wanted to be. He's working as a consultant now, fewer hours, more flexibility, more time with his family, and Rebecca says he's happier than she's seen him in years, lighter somehow, like releasing the weight of his father's expectations allowed him to breathe for the first time since Robert died. He used part of his inheritance to pay off their house, eliminate that second mortgage he'd taken out during the legal battle, and establish college funds for his kids, and the rest he invested conservatively, not trying to grow an empire or prove anything to anyone, just securing his family's future and accepting that enough is enough. Jennifer used her portion to pay off Derek's student loans, something he'd been carrying since college, and to put a down payment on a modest house in a good school district, and to set up a small emergency fund so they'd never feel financially desperate the way they had during some of the lean years. She started a blog about parenting on a budget, teaching other families how to create a rich life without a lot of money, and it's taken off in a way she never expected. thousands of followers who relate to her story and value her perspective, and she told Sarah recently that her father's letter, as painful as it was, pushed her to examine her choices and realize she's actually incredibly proud of the life she's built, the family she's raising, the values she's instilling in her kids, and she doesn't need anyone's approval or validation to know that her life has meaning and purpose. Sarah donated a portion of her inheritance to a family counseling center that specializes in inheritance disputes, wanting something good to come from their pain, wanting to help other families avoid the mistakes they made, and she volunteers there sometimes, talks to families in crisis, shares her story, offers hope that healing is possible even when everything feels irreparably broken. She's also been working with their father's lawyer to develop better practices for will readings, suggesting that lawyers provide families with resources about grief and conflict resolution, that they build in waiting periods before legal action can be taken, that they encourage mediation before litigation, and the lawyer, who'd felt terrible about what happened to the Morrisons, has implemented several of her suggestions, hoping to prevent other families from imploding the way theirs almost did. The family house, once it sold, they took the ashes of both parents and scattered them in the backyard, under the oak tree where they'd had countless family barbecues and birthday parties and ordinary summer evenings, and they planted a new tree there too, a young oak that the new owners have agreed to care for, a living memorial that will grow and change and outlast all of them. Jennifer said it felt right, returning their parents to that space that held so much love and life, letting them rest in the place where they'd been happiest, and she said she hopes the new owners make their own memories there, raise their own family in those rooms, fill that house with laughter and life so it doesn't just become a monument to what was lost. They've talked about writing their own wills now, all three of them, being intentional about what they leave to their children and how they communicate their wishes, and they've made a pact to review their wills together every few years, to make sure nobody's writing something that will create the same pain they experienced, to hold each other accountable for leaving behind legacy rather than landmines. Sarah's will splits everything equally between her two kids, with clear instructions that if either child contests it they forfeit their entire share, a harsh consequence designed to prevent the exact scenario they lived through, and she's talked to her kids about this, explained why equal division matters, listened to their feelings, created space for discussion so nothing comes as a surprise after she's gone. Michael's will includes a clause that if he and Rebecca die before their kids are adults the children will be raised by Sarah and Jennifer together, shared guardianship, because he wants his kids to maintain those sibling relationships, to grow up knowing both their aunts, to have the family connection he almost destroyed, and both sisters cried when he told them about this clause, understanding it as an apology and a promise and a statement of trust that meant more than any words could express. Jennifer's will, in addition to equal division among her 4 children, includes a letter, but this letter is different from the one their father wrote. It's full of affirmation and love and specific memories of what she values about each child, their unique qualities and contributions and the joy they've brought to her life, and she updates it every year, adding new memories and observations, making sure that if something happens to her and Derek their children will have a document that reminds them they were loved completely and unconditionally, no qualifications or judgments, just pure love. I think that's the real lesson here, the one that transcends this specific family and applies to all of us. We have the power to shape our legacy, not through money or property or what we leave behind materially but through how we love people, how we communicate that love, how intentional we are about making sure the people we care about know their worth and value. Robert Morrison failed at that, whatever his intentions were, whatever he thought he was accomplishing with that letter, he failed to make all 3 of his children feel equally loved and valued, and that failure rippled out in ways that almost destroyed everything he'd built, not the business empire but the family, the relationships, the love that actually mattered. But here's the thing, and this is important, that failure doesn't define the Morrison family's story, their response to the failure does. The fact that they fought their way back to each other, that they chose healing over bitterness, that they're actively working to make sure their own children don't inherit the same wounds they carried. That's the legacy that matters, not the $2 million or the commercial real estate empire, but 3 siblings who loved each other enough to do the hardest work humans can do: admitting fault, extending forgiveness, changing patterns, staying connected when disconnection would be easier, showing up imperfectly but consistently for each other and for themselves. Sarah told me something profound last week when we were having coffee. She said, "I used to think the inheritance destroyed our family, but now I think it revealed our family, showed us who we really were underneath the performance, and yes, that was painful beyond anything I'd ever experienced, but it was also necessary, because you can't heal wounds you don't know exist, you can't fix problems you're pretending aren't there, and now we're building something more authentic, more resilient, more real than what we had before, and I'll take real and messy over fake and pretty every single time." I thought about that for days, about the difference between the family we present to the world and the family we actually are, about how crisis strips away pretense and forces authenticity, about whether it's possible to get to that authentic place without crisis, or if sometimes we need things to fall apart so we can rebuild them better. I don't have answers to those questions, not really, but I know that watching the Morrison family almost destroy itself and then choose healing has changed how I think about my own family, my own relationships, the conversations I need to have and the assumptions I need to examine. I've talked to my own siblings more in the past year than I had in the previous 5, really talked about feelings and fears and the dynamics we grew up with that still influence how we interact, and those conversations have been uncomfortable and illuminating and necessary, and I'm grateful to Sarah and her siblings for showing me that it's possible to go into those difficult spaces and come out stronger. The Morrison family isn't fixed, isn't healed completely, probably never will be fully free of the scars from that year when everything fell apart, but they're together, they're trying, they're showing up for each other and for themselves, and that's enough, that has to be enough, because perfect healing isn't possible and perfect families don't exist, and the goal isn't to erase what happened but to integrate it, to let it be part of their story without letting it define their story, to carry the lessons forward while leaving the bitterness behind. I want to leave you with one final image, one final moment that captures where they are now and why their story matters. 2 weeks ago was the 2-year anniversary of Robert's death, and instead of gathering at the cemetery the way they had the first year, instead of spending the day grieving what they'd lost, they decided to celebrate what they'd survived, what they'd rebuilt, what they'd learned. They rented a boat, took all 3 families out on the lake, spent the day swimming and laughing and just being together, and at sunset they each shared a memory of their father, not the complicated painful memories but the simple good ones, moments of connection and love that existed before death and money complicated everything. Sarah shared how Robert taught her to ride a bike, running beside her holding the seat until she found her balance, believing in her capability before she believed in it herself. Michael talked about early morning drives to job sites, learning the business but also learning about integrity and work ethic and treating people with respect regardless of their position. Jennifer remembered her wedding day, how her father had held her hand right before walking her down the aisle, told her she was making a good choice with Derek, that he could see how much Derek loved her, and she said she'd clung to that memory during the months after the will reading when she doubted whether her father had ever approved of her choices, and that memory, that simple affirmation, had helped her forgive him for the letter because she knew in that moment he'd spoken his truth, he had approved, he had valued her choice, and whatever he wrote later was grief and fear talking, not love. They scattered flowers on the water, a mix of wildflowers like the ones Patricia had always kept in their house, and they didn't talk about the inheritance or the fight or any of the pain, they just stood there together watching the sun set and the flowers float away and the water carry them toward the horizon, and Sarah said it felt like releasing the past, not forgetting it but releasing its hold on them, choosing to remember their parents as whole complicated people who loved imperfectly but genuinely, who made mistakes but also created moments of beauty and connection that were worth honoring. That's what I want you to remember from this story, not the destruction but the rebuilding, not the money that almost tore them apart but the love that brought them back together, not the letter that wounded them but the conversations that healed them, because those are the things that matter, those are the things that define us, not our worst moments or our biggest mistakes but how we respond to those moments, what we do with those mistakes. Whether we let them destroy us or whether we use them as opportunities to become better versions of ourselves. The Morrison family is better now, not despite what they went through but in some strange way because of it, because crisis forced them to examine themselves and their relationships and make conscious choices about who they wanted to be and how they wanted to love each other, and those choices, made day after day, conversation after conversation, dinner after dinner, those are what's rebuilding their family into something more authentic and resilient than what existed before. So if you're facing an inheritance dispute right now, if you're watching your family tear itself apart over money, if you're in the middle of that fire wondering if you'll ever find your way out, I want you to know that healing is possible, not easy but possible, and it starts with one person choosing honesty over pretense, choosing connection over being right, choosing to show up even when everything feels broken. It might be you, it might be a sibling, it might be a friend or therapist or mediator, but one person making that choice can shift everything, can create space for others to make similar choices, can start a chain reaction of healing that transforms devastation into growth. And if you're the person writing a will right now, planning your estate, thinking about what you'll leave behind, I'm begging you to have the hard conversations now, while you're alive and can participate in them, while you can hear people's feelings and adjust your plans if needed, while you can explain yourself and reassure people of their value and make sure love is the legacy you leave rather than confusion and hurt. Talk to your children, talk to your family, be honest about your reasoning, listen to their concerns, be willing to prioritize relationship over whatever other goals you might have, because I promise you, I absolutely promise you, the money doesn't matter nearly as much as you think it does, the stuff doesn't matter, what matters is whether the people you love feel loved by you, whether they carry your affirmation or your criticism into their futures, whether your death brings them together or tears them apart. The Morrison family almost didn't make it, came so close to permanent fracture that I lost sleep worrying about Sarah, worrying about all of them, wondering if some breaks are too fundamental to repair, but they proved me wrong, proved that with enough commitment and honesty and willingness to do hard emotional work, families can survive almost anything, can come back from the edge of destruction and build something worth keeping, something real and flawed and beautiful in its imperfection. That's the story I needed to tell you, not a story about money destroying a family but a story about a family choosing each other over money, choosing healing over bitterness, choosing love over pride, and if that's not a story worth sharing, if that's not a message worth spreading, then I don't know what is, because we need more stories of redemption and healing, more examples of people doing the hard work of staying connected, more evidence that even our worst moments don't have to define us. If we're willing to do the work of transforming them into opportunities for growth. The Morrisons are still writing their story, still figuring out what it means to be family in this new configuration, still making mistakes and repairing them and showing up for each other imperfectly but consistently, and that's all any of us can do really, show up, keep trying, choose love even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because that's what family is, that's what love is. Not some fairy tale perfection but messy beautiful commitment to staying connected even when everything in you wants to walk away. So here's my final thought, my final offering to you after sharing this long painful beautiful story of a family that almost destroyed itself and then chose to rebuild. Whether you're dealing with inheritance drama right now or you might face it in the future or you're just trying to understand why families explode over money, remember this, it's never actually about the money, it's about feeling valued and loved and respected, it's about childhood wounds and unresolved feelings and the way we measure our worth through our parents' eyes, and until we understand that, until we address the real issues underneath the financial disputes, we're just fighting symptoms instead of disease, we're just destroying relationships over something that ultimately doesn't matter because when you're lying on your deathbed you're not going to wish you'd fought harder for a bigger inheritance, you're going to wish you'd fought harder for your relationships, for connection, for the love that makes life worth living. Choose wisely, fight for what actually matters, and if you find yourself in the middle of an inheritance battle, take a breath, step back, ask yourself what you're really fighting for and whether winning is worth losing the people you love, because I promise you, having watched this play out in real time with real people I care about, the money won't fill the hole left by broken relationships, The stuff won't comfort you when you're alone. The legal victory won't feel nearly as good as you think it will, and the cost of destroying your family is so much higher than any inheritance could ever be worth. The Morrison family learned that lesson the hard way, almost lost everything learning it, but they learned it, and they're different because of it, better in ways that matter, and their story, painful as it is, gives me hope that we're all capable of more than we think we are, more healing, more forgiveness, more love, more commitment to the relationships that define us and give our lives meaning. If you've made it this far in this story, if you've stayed with me through all the pain and conflict and slow difficult healing, I want to know where you are right now. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching this from, what part of the world you're calling home, whether this story resonated with something in your own life or family, because stories like this matter most when they create connection, when they help us feel less alone in our struggles, when they remind us that other people are fighting similar battles and finding their way through. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about inheritance or family or what actually matters in life, hit that subscribe button because I've got more stories like this one, more real human experiences that strip away the pretense and show us who we really are when we're tested, and I think we need more of that, more honesty, more vulnerability, more willingness to share the messy, difficult parts of being human so we can all learn from each other's experiences and maybe make better choices in our own lives. Next week I'm sharing a story about a couple who rebuilt their marriage after one of them had an affair, and it's not what you'd expect. It's raw and complicated and ultimately hopeful in a way that challenges every assumption about betrayal and forgiveness and whether broken things can truly be made whole again, and I think you're going to want to hear it, so subscribe now so you don't miss it, and in the meantime, take care of your people, have the hard conversations, choose connection over being right, and remember that the best inheritance you can leave isn't money or property but the example of how you loved, how you forgave, how you showed up for the people who mattered even when it was hard, especially when it was hard.